I was sitting in my office, staring at blueprints I couldn't focus on, when my assistant knocked and said the Met Gala was on TV in the break room. I barely looked up. Fashion meant nothing to me anymore. Nothing had meant anything for 12 years. But something made me walk past that room, and something made me glance at the screen. A young woman stood on the red carpet in a flowing silver dress, cameras exploding around her. Then she turned her face toward the camera, smiled that specific smile, and my world stopped spinning. Because I was looking at my daughter, the daughter I'd buried 12 years ago, the daughter I'd watched the lake swallow when she was 8 years old. If you think you know where this story is going, I promise you don't. Stay with me until the end, because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about loss, hope, and the impossible becoming real. My name is Richard, and 12 years ago, I had everything. I ran a successful architecture firm in Chicago, designing buildings that still stand across the skyline. My wife Caroline was a curator at the Art Institute, brilliant and passionate about her work. And our daughter Natalie, she was 8 years old, with dark curls that bounced when she ran, and a laugh that could fill our entire house. She loved drawing dresses on every scrap of paper she could find, convinced she'd be a fashion designer one day. I'd come home from work and find her sketches scattered across the kitchen table, each one more elaborate than the last. We had this tradition every August. Just the three of us would take our sailboat out on Lake Michigan for a long weekend. Nothing fancy, just us, the water, and whatever books and games we'd packed. Natalie loved those trips more than anything. She'd sit at the front of the boat, face to the wind, talking about clouds and waves like they were old friends. August 15th, 2014. That's the date that split my life into before and after. The morning started perfect. Clear skies, calm water. Natalie singing some songs she'd learned at summer camp. Caroline was reading below deck while I taught Natalie how to tie sailor's knots. Her small fingers fumbled with the rope, and she'd giggle every time it came undone. I can still feel the warmth of the sun on my shoulders, still hear her voice asking me to show her one more time. The storm came out of nowhere. I've sailed those waters for 20 years, and I'd never seen anything like it. One moment we were laughing. The next, the sky turned black and the wind hit us like a wall. I told Natalie to get below deck, started pulling down the sails. The boat pitched hard to the left. I heard Caroline scream. When I turned around, Natalie was gone. Just gone. 1 second she was there, the next I was staring at empty space where my daughter had been standing. I jumped in. I didn't think, I just jumped. The water was chaos, waves tossing me like I weighed nothing. I screamed her name until my throat bled. I dove under again and again, my lungs burning, searching through the dark water. Caroline was screaming from the boat. The Coast Guard came. They searched for 5 days. 5 days of boats and helicopters and divers combing every inch of that lake. They found nothing. No body, no clothes, nothing. They told us that sometimes Lake Michigan doesn't give back what it takes. The currents, the depth, the cold water. They said we needed to accept that we'd never have closure, never have answers. We held a funeral with an empty casket. I stood there in a black suit, accepting condolences for a daughter whose body we never found, and something inside me just broke completely. Caroline fell apart in a different way than I did. She'd sit in Natalie's room for hours, holding her stuffed animals, talking to empty air. I threw myself into work, staying at the office until midnight, taking every project I could find. Anything to not be in that house, not see that empty chair at dinner, not walk past that bedroom door. We stopped talking about her because talking hurt too much. We stopped talking about anything. 6 months later, Caroline asked for a divorce. I signed the papers without a fight. What was there to fight for? I became a ghost in my own life. I'd go to therapy because everyone said I should, sit in that chair and say the right things, but inside I was just hollow. Every dark-haired little girl I'd see on the street would make my heart stop. Every laugh that sounded like hers would make me turn around, hoping, always hoping, even though I knew it was impossible. I kept her room exactly as it was, her drawings still on the walls, her last sketch, a dress made of clouds, still on her desk. Years blurred together. My firm grew bigger. I made more money. None of it mattered. I stopped celebrating holidays, stopped seeing friends. My sister would call and beg me to come to family dinners, and I'd make excuses. What was the point? The world had taken the only thing that mattered, and I was just going through the motions until it was over. Every year on August 15th, I'd drive to the lake. I'd stand on that same beach and stare at the water for hours. People probably thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. I'd talk to her sometimes, ask her if she was out there somewhere, if she was okay. I'd apologize for not holding on tighter, for not seeing the storm coming, for failing at the one job that mattered most. Being her father. 12 years. That's how long I lived like that. 12 years of gray days and sleepless nights and dreams where she was still alive, only to wake up and remember all over again. May 2026. I was working late, same as always. My assistant, Rebecca, mentioned something about the Met Gala being on in the break room. The younger staff were watching it on their break. I didn't care. I hadn't cared about art or fashion or culture since the day Natalie disappeared. Those things belonged to the person I used to be. But I needed coffee, and the break room was on the way. I walked past, glanced at the screen out of habit. Models in elaborate costumes, celebrities posing, the usual spectacle. I was about to keep walking when the camera focused on a young woman ascending the stairs. She wore this incredible silver dress that seemed to flow like water, and something about the way she moved made me stop. Then she turned to face the cameras directly and smiled. I don't know how to describe what happened in my body at that moment. My coffee cup slipped from my hand, shattered on the floor. Rebecca jumped up, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. Because I was looking at Natalie, not a girl who looked like her, not someone who reminded me of her. I was looking at my daughter, 12 years older, but unmistakably, impossibly, her. The same eyes, the same smile, the same small birthmark on her left wrist that I could see as she waved to the crowd, the birthmark that looked like a tiny star, that she used to say was her lucky mark. Rebecca was talking to me, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. I grabbed the remote, rewound the footage, watched her walk up those steps again. And again. And again. It was her. I knew my own child. I'd memorized every detail of her face during those 5 days of searching, during the thousands of times I'd looked at her photos afterward. I ran to my office, hands shaking so badly I could barely type. I searched Met Gala, scrolled through hundreds of images until I found her. The caption read, "Model Natasha Moreau stuns in custom design." I clicked through to her profile. French-based model, 20 years old, represented by an agency in Paris. 20 years old. Natalie would be 20 years old now. I spent the entire night searching everything I could find about Natasha Moreau. There were interviews, fashion spreads, behind-the-scenes videos. She spoke with a French accent, perfect and natural. She talked about growing up in a small town in Brittany, about being discovered at 16, about her love for avant-garde fashion, about her adoptive parents, Pierre and Juliette, who'd given her everything. Adoptive parents. I watched every video I could find, looking for proof I wasn't losing my mind. In one interview, she talked about having fragmentary memories from before she was 8, about nightmares of water and storms that she couldn't explain. The interviewer had asked if she'd ever tried to find her birth family, and she'd gotten this sad look in her eyes and said, "I don't know who they were. I don't even know my real name." The next morning, I hired the best private investigator I could find. I needed facts. I needed proof. I couldn't show up in this girl's life claiming to be her dead father based on a resemblance and a birthmark. The investigator, a woman named Patricia, came back with a file 2 weeks later. Natasha Moreau, born name unknown, had been found on a beach in Michigan on August 22, 2014, 7 days after my daughter disappeared, 140 miles north of where we'd been. She'd been discovered by a fisherman, unconscious, suffering from severe hypothermia and head trauma. No identification, no memory of who she was or how she got there. She'd been taken to a local hospital, treated for her injuries. Authorities had checked missing persons reports, but somehow, they'd never connected her to our case. Different county, different jurisdiction, and we'd been searching the waters near Chicago while she'd washed up nearly at the Wisconsin border. The currents had carried her. For 7 days, my 8-year-old daughter had survived in Lake Michigan, and nobody had connected the dots. A French couple, Pierre and Juliette Moreau, had been visiting the area. They were in their 40s, unable to have children of their own. They'd volunteered to foster her while authorities searched for her family. Weeks turned into months. She never remembered. No one ever claimed her. They'd fallen in love with this little girl who drew pictures of dresses and smiled despite having lost everything. They'd adopted her legally, moved back to France, given her a new life. I read that file until I had it memorized. Then I read it again, looking for any possibility that I was wrong, that I was seeing what I wanted to see. But everything fit. The timing, the location, the age, the amnesia, the birthmark that matched the one in the photos I'd given Patricia. I needed a DNA test, but first, I needed to find her. I flew to Paris in June. I'd contacted her agency, said I was a potential client interested in booking her for a campaign. They'd arranged a meeting at a cafe in the Marais district. I'd practiced what I'd say 1,000 times on the plane. Every version sounded insane. She walked in wearing jeans and a simple white shirt, looking nothing like the glamorous model from the Met Gala. She looked like a regular 20-year-old meeting a client for coffee. She looked like my daughter. We sat down. She smiled politely, started talking about her work in that French accent, and I just started crying. Right there in that cafe, I broke down completely. She looked alarmed, asked if I was okay, if she should call someone. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and showed her a photo. Natalie, at 8 years old, wearing a blue sundress, holding up a drawing she'd made. Natasha went very still. I showed her another photo. Natalie on our boat, the same boat she'd fallen from. Another one. Natalie and me, her sitting on my shoulders, both of us laughing. "What is this?" she whispered. I told her everything. Who I was, what had happened that day on the lake, how we'd searched, how we'd never found her, how I'd lived the last 12 years believing she was dead, how I'd seen her on television 4 weeks ago and my entire world had turned upside down. She was shaking her head, saying it wasn't possible, that she was Natasha Moreau, that her parents found her, but she was French. She'd always been French. But her hands were trembling, and she kept looking at the photos. I showed her the birthmark on her wrist in one of the childhood photos. She looked down at her own wrist, at that same star-shaped mark. I told her about the dreams she'd mentioned in interviews, about water and storms. I told her about how she used to draw dresses, how she'd wanted to be a fashion designer since she was 5 years old. I told her things only Natalie would know, things no stranger could possibly have learned. "I don't remember," she kept saying. "I don't remember any of this." But she was crying too now, and I could see something in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or just the terrible possibility that everything she thought she knew about herself might be wrong. I asked her to take a DNA test, just to know for sure. She agreed, I think just to prove me wrong, to make this crazy American man leave her alone. We went to a clinic that same day. The results took 3 days. 3 days where I barely slept, barely ate. 3 days where Natasha, I'd learned, also barely slept. She'd called me twice, asking questions about the little girl in the photos. What was her favorite color? Purple. What did she want to be when she grew up? A fashion designer who made dresses for princesses. What was her favorite food? My pasta carbonara, the one I'd make every Sunday. And then the email came. 99.9% probability of paternity. She was mine. She was Natalie. My daughter was alive. I called her. She answered on the first ring. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that sounded like she was 8 years old again, "What was my name?" "My real name?" "Natalie," I said. "Your name was Natalie." She came to my hotel that evening. We sat on the balcony overlooking the Paris streets, and I told her everything about the life she'd lost, about her mother, about our house, about how she'd leave her drawings everywhere, about the songs she'd sing, about how much she'd been loved. And slowly, carefully, she told me about the life she'd built, about Pierre and Juliette, who'd given her everything, who'd encouraged her art, who'd supported her dreams, about growing up in Brittany, learning to love the ocean even though it scared her, about the nightmares that had finally started to make sense, about the feeling she'd always had that something was missing, that there was a hole in her past that she couldn't fill. We cried together. We laughed together when I told her stories about the trouble she'd get into as a kid. We sat in silence together, processing the impossible fact that we'd both been given something we'd thought was lost forever. Meeting Pierre and Juliette was harder than I'd expected. They were terrified they'd lose her, but they were also kind, decent people who'd saved my daughter's life. They'd given her love when she had nothing. They'd raised her into this incredible young woman. How could I be anything but grateful? We all met at their home in Brittany. It was awkward and painful and beautiful all at once. We were two sets of parents, two families, trying to figure out how to share someone we all loved. But we figured it out because Natalie Natasha needed all of us. I called Caroline. That was its own kind of healing. We met in Paris, the three of us, and we held each other and cried and laughed and couldn't quite believe it was real. Our daughter was alive. Our beautiful girl had survived the impossible and found her way back to us. It's been 8 months since that night I saw her on television. 8 months of learning who she is now, of sharing stories about who she was then. She goes by both names now, Natalie and Natasha, says they're both part of who she is. She splits her time between Paris and Chicago. She's met her grandparents, her aunts and uncles, her cousins. She's introduced us to her world, to fashion and art, and the life she's built. Her memories are starting to come back, slowly, just fragments. The smell of my cologne, the sound of Caroline's laugh, the feeling of being on the boat. The doctors say she may never remember everything, and that's okay. We have now, we have tomorrow. We have time we thought we'd lost forever. I learned something through all of this. Grief can make you believe the world is only darkness, that miracles don't happen, that hope is just another word for self-deception. I lived 12 years in that darkness. I built walls so high that I couldn't see anything beyond my own pain. But sometimes the impossible happens. Sometimes the lake gives back what it took. Sometimes the daughter you buried comes walking up the steps of the Met Gala in a silver dress, and your whole world remembers how to beat again. If this story touched you, if it reminded you that miracles still happen even in our darkest moments, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who might need to hear that hope isn't foolish, that sometimes, against every odd, the universe hands you back what it took away. Leave a comment telling me what this story meant to you. And remember, no matter how dark it gets, no matter how impossible something seems, keep your heart open, because you never know when everything might change. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for believing in impossible things with me.